As we learned in the last unit with the maiden voyage of Christopher Columbus and the increased and improved transportation technology and the closing of the Far East by way of the Red Sea by the Muslims, Western Europeans rushed to stake their claim in the New World and liberate its possible riches. Although late to the game, Britain, using a 6-year deadline, attempted to begin a colony in the area they named Virginia after their queen. So what we're going to look at here is the colony at Roanoke. And this is an island off the coast of what was named Virginia. It is now North Carolina today. But we're going to look at, was it successful or was it really a failure? So we're going to kind of look at the steps that got us to where the legend has it as the lost colony of Roanoke. So let's take a step back and look at Spain's legacy just to make sure we're all on the same page. And as we know, of course, that Isabella and Ferdinand get married. What they did with this marriage was they were able to combine the two kingdoms that were essentially making up Spain at the time, and that's Castile and Aragon. When the two come together, they quickly work to clean up Spain. They finished the job of removing the Muslims who had controlled a great deal of Spain for hundreds of years. They were able to eliminate crime, and they quickly went to work on paying off debt. And so what they did was they set the stage for what will become Christopher Columbus's first voyage. Of course, they don't know they're going to do that. It's not until Columbus comes to them and suggests this, but they have really kind of created a situation where they can now take a risk. And because the two are very young and they really do work well together, they are able to take that risk and fund Christopher Columbus's voyage. And so that sets off a frenzy of exploration, especially by the Spanish. And it's incredible what they were able to accomplish, because soon after Columbus goes and comes back, the conquistadors are set free in the New World. And we've kind of already talked about that story. But it's really important to understand that Spain has set the stage with Isabella and Ferdinand for what is to come. Okay, so now jump ahead from Christopher Columbus's maiden voyage for about 50, 60 years. The British are now starting to realize that the Spanish have controlled this new world, and they've been able to really discover that entire coastline and have been extracting gold and silver and just learning an incredible amount about what the new world has to offer. Well, Britain is now starting to get interested in this, and they would like to stake their claim as well. So they start setting their own goals for the new world. And as we know, Spain really kind of takes care of most of Central America and South America with the Portuguese and a little bit of the Caribbean islands. And they really haven't touched what will become the original 13 colonies. So Britain sees that as maybe their in with the New World. And their competition, of course, is France and Canada, what is today Canada. So here are their goals. They're looking for the Northwest Passage, as many other countries were looking for as well, this way to get from one side of the New World to the other through a waterway and make it to the Far East. Because again, like we said, the Mediterranean is closed for the most part, especially as you get closer to the Red Sea, because the Muslims have control over that area and they are not willing to allow the Europeans to kind of come in and use those passageways. They, of course, want to find gold because they're seeing what Spain has done. They found an incredible amount of gold. They have strengthened their economy, or at least what people thought was happening was they strengthened their economy in the New World. And they would like to, the British would like to be at the same, point in their economy as well. And of course, because Spain and Britain do not get along, it would be a great competition of the British and the Spanish for the British to win in North America as we know it. And so any way to kind of squash Spain's world domination plan would be beneficial as well. Just, bragging rights, if you will. Now, one important aspect that we need to look at is Spain by the end of the 1500s. Now, this was a nation from the time of, the beginnings of Columbus and the conquistadors under Isabella and Ferdinand that was extremely powerful because not only did they have land and claims to land, but they had made incredible treaties with their next door neighbor, Portugal. So there was no worries about fighting or any sort of war. And then they had extracted all this silver and gold. And they created what is the beginnings of globalization with this money system and so on and so forth. And they've made themselves very powerful. But what they did was they extracted the gold and put more and more and more in circulation. And so this becomes a problem by the end of the 1500s for Spain. So by 1575, Philip II is the king of Spain. And by that point, he had already defaulted on his debt 3 times due to increased military cost and the decreased value of gold. Gold is used as a medium of exchange. It's used for money and exchanging for goods, just like we use our money today. And so the value is set by the market. And just like our dollar changes value from day to day as to what's going on in the market, the same thing happened with gold. And because there was so much gold in circulation, the value, of course, decreased. And so when it decreased, it generated inflation. So inflation, just as basic economics, it encourages borrowing and discourages lending. So very, very few other countries were willing to lend to Spain because the value wasn't there. Their nation was based on a false economy. They were in debt. They were essentially, spending with deficit, essentially. And so the tension between the two of, borrowing and lending prevents you from spending money wisely. And the problem with Philip II is he needed to build his military up, but when you build your military, it's an investment. It is a long-term investment because you need to continue to feed and clothe your military personnel. You need to have equipment. You need to have weapons, ships, and so on and so forth. So it's not something of let's just build a navy today and once we have the cost for that, it's fine. It's something that is constantly going to have to be paid for as time goes on. And so it is very difficult to do something like that in a time of increased inflation. So Spain is hurting economically. It's not necessarily that everybody realizes that or knows that because they seem so wealthy, but it is all very false. And it's something to pay attention to, and it's important to understand because that is going to have an effect on Britain's decisions in the next coming years. So let's look at why did Spain's economy fail? The first thing is that we need to notice here is that they stole gold. They went to the New World and they took it from the native peoples. And they extracted it. They used the natives as slaves to extract it, and they quickly brought it back to Spain. They then became a nation of consumers. So at first they had an incredible amount of money, and they were able to purchase whatever they needed. They could build up a huge military, and they had the money to do so, whereas other nations around them didn't necessarily. And so that's fine, but the problem is they never then invested their money into production. And so they bought, but never put it back into the system. And so they didn't produce anything. So now, in order to keep up this style of living, they have to keep extracting gold. Well, because they keep extracting gold, it's not a commodity anymore, essentially. There's too much of it. And so therefore it's not special and it's not valuable. So that created inflation, as we talked about in the last slide. And lastly, of course, we know this, gold is not a renewable resource. So once it dries up, it's gone. And the fact that Spain did not take the money that they were able to get with the gold that they found and put it back into themselves, they didn't invest back into themselves, they start to struggle a great deal. And that's what's going to be the difference between Spain and Britain. Britain will take their wealth and create a really strong economy. And we're going to see that in just a little bit here. Okay, so we know that Spain is struggling economically in the time of Elizabeth I. And so Elizabeth realizes the value of the New World, and she wants to get her footing there. You know, she knows that something is valuable there, but the problem is she really doesn't have the money to do so, and she needs to get some sort of funding. So she has explorers out, and she's funding different explorers, as we know, but one of the most prominent and most successful would be Sir Francis Drake. And he takes this this voyage, you know, across the world, and he sails every which way, and he makes great strides. So as he's traveling, he keeps bumping into the Spanish. Well, of course, as we know, the Spanish are in the New World extracting all this gold. So Drake sees it as, why do I need to do the work? I'll just steal from them. And so in an act of piracy, he steals their gold and silver, and he immediately takes it back to Queen Elizabeth. So now Queen Elizabeth has this amount of money. And it's certainly not as much as the Spanish are bringing in, but remember, the Spanish are mismanaging their money. So she realizes that this gold that has been stolen and the silver that has been stolen, she needs to utilize it to her advantage. So the first thing she's going to do is pay off debt. So when she gets rid of that debt, now the money that's coming in through taxes and just the other things that they're producing, and it's not a great deal, but what they are producing, that money now can be used to invest in a navy, a very, very powerful navy, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful navy in the world. And being that England is an island, it makes sense that they would invest in a navy, and they quickly get the best of the best. So they really start to look at what are the cutting edge technology that will be used in this navy, because they want the best. They want to put their money here, and they know if they can do that, they can certainly begin something in the New World. They feel that there's something that could be done there, as well as across the world. So this is going to be the beginning of where the British create an empire, and they quickly begin to utilize what is out there to their advantage, because Britain really doesn't have a great deal of resources. One of the best resources they have is coal, but they don't really realize at this point in time how to use it, and that it can be used to their advantage. But what they're going to be able to do is eventually take over India, and of course we know the New World, and so these areas will start to bring in either resources or money from what they can produce, such as with Jamestown and tobacco. And so what they're able to do is then invest that money back into themselves and become an industrial nation. So of course Elizabeth wants to make her mark in the New World. And her thought is that since nobody really has colonized what is today Virginia and North Carolina, they thought that that might be the best place to attempt a colony, because the French are still very much so north in what is today Canada, and the Spanish are very much so south or in the Caribbean or South America. So this might give us a chance to, kind of start a colony and without any conflict, except for the natives, of course. So she sends a man by the name of Humphrey Gilbert. And he ends up going, and he looks around and he finds a good spot, and he does a little bit of exploring. But while he's sailing, he ends up being lost at sea. So he dies. So his stepbrother is Sir Walter Raleigh. And Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth have a bit of a secret love affair that's going on. And of course, nobody's allowed to know about this. And she feels that he would be perfect to get a colony started. However, she, being that she loves him, she does not want him to actually go to the colony. She doesn't want him to actually leave, but just kind of get it set up, get the people that need to be there, set up a primitive government, those kind of things. And one of the reasons is that area that I'm talking about where they would like to colonize was known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, because so many ships were headed that way, and they would be run aground or they would sink just miles off the coast. And so she of course doesn't want him to die. And so she sets this timeline of 6 years, and she said a colony needs to be set up by 1578, and this is a 6-year contract. And so Raleigh puts together a group of men of varying talents, but again, he doesn't go because Queen Elizabeth doesn't want him to. And so they end up headed towards Roanoke. And they decide they're going to set up a colony on Roanoke Island. They call it, of course, Virginia, but later, as we know, that is actually North Carolina today. So the group arrives on Roanoke Island and decide that they're going to set up their base there, their camp there, and begin to explore and so on and so forth. Well, they come in contact with the Algonquin natives. Now, the Algonquin natives there, within their specific tribes, were the Sikatan people and the Croatoan people. And these people are part of a permanent civilization. And so what that means is they're not nomadic. They stay put. They are able to grow their food there. And so their structures are permanent. Their society is very similar to any European society in the sense that they have a system of education. They have a system of government. They have societal roles and societal rules and norms. And so they really do mirror a great deal of what the Europeans who are coming into contact with them. They have very similar values. They may be slightly different in religion or dress or what have you, but the basics are very similar. And so these two groups really do get along very well. And they're able to exchange items, and the natives help them learn, what grows there, and so on and so forth. And so this group, along with two Croatoans, return to England and say, hey, this is a great place. We need to bring another group. It is time. This will be a great place for our colony. We work well with the natives. We understand the food that they're growing. We know how to do it, and so on and so forth. So they feel that this is a good gamble, if you will. So England decides to send a new group back to Roanoke Island. And so what they do is they send, instead of families or those who would really start a colony and be able to allow for a colony to flourish, they just send a group of soldiers. And so this group comes back and they decide what they're going to do is look for gold. Now, as we know, there is no gold in North Carolina. And so they quickly are agitated and irritated that they are there on this fool's mission, and they're not really setting up a colony as what was intended. And so because all they do is look for gold, they don't put any effort into actually building a camp, building structures, growing food, making good relations with the natives. Instead, they decide to steal the natives' food. And so this relationship that was formed just a couple years earlier with the first group is no longer there. And there's all this great mistrust and bad feelings and so on and so forth. And so there becomes an issue over a silver cup. And it's said that the natives stole this silver cup from this group of soldiers. Now, keep in mind perspective here. This is what is going to set off a war. Okay, so I'm sure there's no evidence of who or what happened with this silver cup, or if it was actually stolen. But the response is fascinating. Over the theft of this cup sets off a war. And the soldiers that are left there end up killing the natives that are living amongst that area. They end up burning their village to the ground. And so leaving a terrible taste in everybody's mouth, as you can imagine. And so when the supply ship arrives back to Roanoke Island after this, war that happens, the Civil War, the Englishmen quickly jump back on the ship and they go back to England. And so now what are we going to do? Now what is England going to do? They wanted to start a colony, but there's this, bad blood that has now been created. So at this point, we are at the 1580s, the early 1580s. And England, of course, is attempting to set up a colony in Roanoke. And at the same time, Spain is continuing to struggle. And as their inflow of gold is decreasing, their power is also decreasing. And their military is becoming outdated, and it's decreasing as well. And so many of the little independent nations that were taken over by the Spanish are starting to break away. And so Spain's power is starting to decrease again. And so because of that, it's opening the door for Britain and France to thrive in the New World. And this will be the pattern that will be set all the way till 1898 with the Spanish-American War. So we'll see how Spain's dominance in this area will start to decrease and decrease and decrease. So by the 1580s, as I said, Spain is has to make some decisions, and one of their decisions is to act upon this rivalry between England and Spain. So what we need to understand here is the importance of religion, of course. Spain is a Catholic nation under King Philip II. And England, being controlled by Queen Elizabeth I, is a Protestant nation. And their church, of course, is the Anglican Church. Now, Elizabeth's sister, Mary, was, of course, Catholic because her mother was Catholic, and her mother was Isabella's daughter. If you can, if you go back to Isabella and Ferdinand. And so there's a link there. Well, when Mary dies and Elizabeth I ascends the throne, she then takes the religion from being Catholic and returns it to Protestantism. And so there's a bad blood there. Now, at the same time, Elizabeth's first cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, is Catholic. And Mary, Queen of Scots, attempted to overthrow Queen Elizabeth. So, as you can imagine, her fate was sealed. And in 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots was King Philip II's cousin. So, now that your head is spinning here, Mary, Queen of Scots, dies, and Philip II decides to kind of wage war on Britain. And so there's this element of the bad blood with relations, religion, and the other issue, of course, is piracy, as we learned with Sir Edmund Drake. So King Philip II decides to build up a huge navy as best that he can with the money that he has. And this becomes the Spanish Armada. So now it's going to set forth this feud that will take place between England and Spain. So at the same time, England decides that there needs to be a new plan for setting up Roanoke. And the new plan needs to not include soldiers, but instead send families. And so Britain sends 90 men, 20 women, and 10 children to Roanoke Island. And the leader is going to be John White. And John White actually brings a great deal of his own family there. So many of the inhabitants of this new colony, this final Roanoke colony, will be many of his children and grandchildren and so on. And so they arrive, and they immediately are distrusted by the natives that are there. History is going to prevent this from being a successful colony. And what ends up happening is one of the Englishmen who are out hunting ends up getting killed by one of the natives. And so, again, this bad blood just doesn't sit well with anybody. And so John White needed supplies, and he returns to England. The problem is, remember, this is the 1580s, and Spain is waging war on Britain. So they're blocking, not only are they blocking passage to the New World, they're blocking France, they're blocking the Dutch, they're blocking the British from getting to the New World with this grand armada. They're also forcing England to hold on to any ships that they have. So when John White goes back to get his family and his colony more supplies, he can't make it back to the colony. And so as he's wanting to get back, they have to use every vessel that they can in order to attack and defend against the Spanish Armada. So in this 3-year battle, Spain is going to throw at England everything they have. And unfortunately, because they didn't have a great deal of money, their military just can't meet or match the British, especially their Navy, of course. And so, although they put as much effort as they possibly can, the British Navy is much stronger. And by 1588, the Spanish Armada is defeated by the English, which not only gives England dominance in Europe, but it now gives them freedom and dominance in the New World. So now we need to look at what do today's historians believe actually happened to the colonists on Roanoke Island. So what I want you to do here is watch this video, and you'll be able to get a better sense of how history has changed, or how history's interpretations have changed. Where is this really a lost colony, or what else? Did something else happen? So go ahead, watch the video, and we'll see what you think.
So it's like 1588 when John White sails back to England, and because of the Spanish Armada, it's not until 1590 that he can finally get back and try to find these colonists, including his family.
Right.
When he gets there, this is all he finds: the word Croatoan carved into a tree.
What do you mean, all he fought? What happened to their town?
It was completely abandoned. So it looks as if they left of their own volition.
Okay.
Because it doesn't look like there was an attack there. And they had agreed beforehand that if they decided to go somewhere else, remember, they already knew that they were in unwelcome territory, so they thought maybe they'd go farther inland. They would leave traces. They would carve something in a tree to say where they had gone. Unfortunately, another storm hit, and so John White was forced to leave and go back to England without ever going to see the Croatoans, this other Native American tribe, along with their town called Croatoan, to see where the rest of his family and the rest of the colonists were.
Did he ever return in his lifetime?
No, he did not.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
So he never found out what happened to his family, and technically we never found out what happened to the lost colony at Roanoke, but there's some pretty good evidence about what might have happened to them.
Tell it to me, Kim.
All right, so here's what we think may have happened. So there are about 130 people, right?
Right.
Assuming that none of them died from disease.
That's a charitable assumption.
Yeah. Not all of them could have gone to see and live with the Croatoans.
Okay.
Right? Because they were a much smaller tribe than that, so they could never have been all supported by these people. What we think happened is that some of them went to live with the Croatoans who are along the coast. So if John White comes back, then they can connect up with him again. So that's what we think happened to some of them. We also think that some of them went further inland to a more stable environment around what is maybe called Mary Hill. So about 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island.
Okay.
Today, Mary Hill, North Carolina. And we think some of them may have gone north. So here's the evidence about these various things.
Yeah, how do we know that these colonists went there?
So when John White was sailing to Roanoke, he saw big fires along the coast where the Croatoans lived. So we think the English may have been there trying to signal them, but he went straight to Roanoke, and then because of his troubles with his ship, had to go back to England. So there's strong evidence there. Also later, an Englishman heard a legend from the people who lived in that region that some of their ancestors had been white people, and they had English coins. So I think it's probably safe to say that some of them did actually intermarry with Croatoans and lived there for most of the rest of their lives. The ones who went north we know about because John Smith, the captain of the Jamestown colony in 1607, met up with some Native Americans who told him that there had been white people living in the area who had lived peacefully among the Native Americans until just recently when they were massacred by the Powhatans. Powhatan was the father of Pocahontas, right? So there's some overlap here.
So he was trying to get the lay of the land, how the local people felt about the English, and the intelligence that he got was, oh, everyone's cool with the English except for the people that you're living right next to.
I think it was probably intended, to be maybe a warning. We think what might actually have happened was that the people from Roanoke had intermarried with another Native American tribe and had become kind of indistinguishable from them. And then the Powhatans, who were kind of a larger empire, actually attacked them. So they were killed off in a raid against other Native American groups.
I see.
And the last thing that we think that they probably went inland is from a recent archaeological dig, which has discovered what's called English border ware.
Okay.
In this town near Mary Hill, North Carolina. And it was only made in this time period before these English colonists left. So we know it has to have dated before 1588.
So.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's highly likely that at least some of those people had been living in this area because we have an archaeological record of them.
That's so cool.
What I think is really interesting about this is we actually know a lot more about this than I think popular legend says that we do.
Yeah, I always thought that the lost colony at Roanoke was one of those unsolvable secrets of history.
I think it tells us a lot about the historical process. In some ways we know a lot about this. In other ways we don't know much at all. You know, there are some things in history that we don't have records about and perhaps never will. But if I had to say that there's one thing that's really haunting about this colony at Roanoke is just how different things might have been had they chosen to be friendly about the theft of a silver cup that may or may not have happened rather than angry and violent. We could be talking about the colony of Roanoke as the very first successful English colony in the New World.
You and I could have been speaking like an Algonquian English dialect right now.
Quite possibly. So it shows us just how important even the smallest events in history can be to the way that things turn out and how much people's choices really do matter.